If you're working with raw files, instead of opening the image into Photoshop and then converting it to a smart object, you can choose to open the raw file into Photoshop directly as a smart object. This will enable us to access the raw data if we want to make changes. So from Bridge, I'm going to select the sand dollar and the wall texture files, and we're going to open them in Camera Raw. I'm going to make a rather significant change to the sand dollar. I'm going to increase the whites rather dramatically, and then I'm going to decrease the blacks. Then I'll select both of these thumbnails, and instead of choosing open, I'll use the downward pointing arrow in order to open as object. This is going to tell Camera Raw to open both of those images as smart objects into their own separate documents. Here we can see we have the wall texture as well as the sand dollars. In order to put them into the same document, I'll choose Window and Arrange, and then Tile. Then with the sand dollar image selected, I'll use the Layers panel to drag and drop the sand dollar into the wall. I no longer need the sand dollar image open, so let's go ahead and close that, and I don't need to save changes. I'm only going to use one of the sand dollars, so I'll go ahead and rearrange this. And let's mask out the background. I'm going to switch to the Object Selection tool, and with the Object Finder enabled, Photoshop will automatically find any objects in the image. When I position my cursor on top of the sand dollar and click, we can see that Photoshop has automatically selected it. But I'm going to need to refine the edge of the object, so I'll choose Select and Mask. On the right-hand side, I have the view set to on layers, so we can see what this is going to look like when it's compositive. And we can see there's a slight halo around the sand dollar. In order to fix that, I'm going to add a slight feather under the global refinements, and then use the Shift Edge slider in order to choke the mask to make it form a little bit more tighter around the sand dollar. All right, I'll scroll down, and under the output options, I'm going to output to a layer mask. And we can see in the layers panel, we now have a mask for our sand dollar. I also want to create a drop shadow, so I'll choose the effects icon and select drop shadow. We can reposition the drop shadow in the image area by just dragging it. In this case, I want to decrease the opacity a little bit and just move it a little bit closer to the sand dollar. All right, when I'm finished, we'll go ahead and apply that. But now I want to make some changes to the tone and the color in the sand dollar. If I had just opened this as a pixel-based layer, then those changes would be destructive. But because I opened it as a smart object, I can edit the contents of the smart object, and Photoshop will re-render the file using the highest quality information possible. I can choose the Layer menu and then select Smart Objects in order to edit the contents, or we can just double click on the thumbnail for the smart object in the Layers panel. I'm going to increase the exposure overall, but then I need to decrease the highlights in the image. I'm going to increase the shadows and then decrease the overall saturation. When I'm finished, Photoshop will re-render that, giving me the best quality image possible. Now, another way to place a raw file as a smart object is to use the File menu and then choose Place Embedded. We can navigate to the Smart Objects folder and double-click on the paper texture in order to add it. Photoshop will display the Camera Raw dialog in case I want to make changes. For now, I'll just click OK to place this as a smart object. I'll tap the check mark in order to place the file as the same size as the document. Now, over in the Layers panel, I'm going to change the blend mode for this texture to Overlay, but I don't like the blue tint that it's adding, so I'll double-click in order to edit the contents of the smart object and decrease the saturation and apply that change. I think the background wall needs a slight adjustment, so I will double-click on the thumbnail for the wall texture. I'm going to decrease the overall exposure, but then I'm going to increase the shadows, and I'll also increase the whites. I'll decrease the overall saturation, and I'll use the masking tool in order to select a linear gradient and drag from the right side into the center of the image. Then I'll increase the exposure on the right side and decrease the saturation a little bit more in this localized area. We'll go ahead and apply all those adjustments, all non-destructively. Excellent. At this point, I'll choose File and then Save As. I'm going to save it to my computer, and I will append the file name with an underscore '01. We'll save it to the same folder as a layered Photoshop file, and then close the image and return to Bridge. Here we can see that the initial adjustment that I made to the sand dollar image where I lightened the whites are reflected in the original image in Bridge. However, the changes that I made after placing the images as smart objects in the layered PSD file only affect those embedded smart objects. So you can see the flexibility that you get when you bring raw files into Photoshop. You can always reprocess them non-destructively, and you don't lose any image quality, which can be really important, especially when you start compositing images together.